Paul McCartney is one of the few artists who didn't just write music, he redefined what music could be. His voice became the soundtrack of an entire century. His guitar lines carved themselves into the hearts of millions. Every note he wrote turned into a memory, and every lyric became a thread connecting generation after generation. But behind the lights was a man living with voids no amount of time could ever fill, losing his mother when he was only 14. The painful collapse of the Beatles, the despair that swallowed him when his wife Linda passed away, and for a long stretch afterward, the feeling of drifting, with no sense of where his life was supposed to go. And yet from that very bottom, he stood back up, not through miracles, but through the willpower of someone who refused to let heartbreak steal the one thing that still kept him alive: music. Now at 83, life is testing Paul McCartney once more, a heartbreaking turn that no one could have imagined. And before we go any further, if his music has ever touched you even for the briefest moment, leave a heart as a quiet tribute to the man whose art has been healing us for so many years. Long before the world knew his name, long before the melodies that shook entire stadiums, there was a quiet boy growing up among the cracked walls of post-war England. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942 in Liverpool, a city shattered by bombs to the point where even the sky seemed a shade darker. He did not come into the world wrapped in luxury. He entered life amid the smell of crushed brick cement dust and unpaid bills. The McCartney family lived in a modest terraced house in the Allerton district on 20 Forthland Road. In that small home, the only thing they had in abundance was faith and hope. They were working-class people struggling like countless families in the post-war years, yet they clung tightly to dignity, to music, and to love, the last three things no hardship could take from them. His mother Mary was a devoted nurse, a woman who came home with aching legs but always managed to smile at her sons. His father Jim was a part-time jazz musician with an upright piano whose paint had long been chipped away, yet every key carried a quiet promise his children would one day have a better life. Paul's earliest memories were not of extravagant trips, but of evenings spent gathered around the dinner table, where his father's piano blended with his mother's laughter, interrupted by murmurs about the uncertain tomorrow. Then, in 1956, when Paul was only 14, that small world suddenly came to a halt. There was no explosion, no dramatic moment, just something that happened quietly, yet it was enough to steer his childhood onto a path that would never turn back. Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer and passed away almost in a single breath. That evening, she had warmed a pot of tea and left it on the table. By the next morning, only her chair sat there cold in a way that was terrifying. Years later, Paul recalled with heartbreak, one minute she was there, the next minute she was gone. Her death didn't just cut his childhood in half, it broke something deep inside him. The wound was so profound that decades later, its tremors could still be felt in the tender yet haunting ballads he wrote, like "Let It Be," where Mother Mary, appearing in a dream, was the resurrected shadow of the mother he had lost far too soon. After Mary's passing, Jim McCartney had to carry the weight of the entire family. Every early morning, he quietly placed breakfast on the table, then sat at the old piano and played a few notes to chase away the coldness creeping into every corner of the house. Paul and his brother Michael would stand in the doorway, not crying, simply watching him as if he were the last thread holding the three of them together. Jim didn't speak much. He just kept playing, letting music fill the empty spaces where words could no longer reach. He was the one who placed the first chords into Paul's hands, gently opening for him the doorway to a world the boy would later rule. He let Paul try every instrument in the house. Gradually, the small living room became a sanctuary for father and son, a place where each melody existed not just to be heard, but to breathe, to keep life moving forward after a loss far too large for any family to carry. "Music saved me," Paul would say years later. And it was true. The little house on Forthland Road, once drowned in grief, slowly became the cradle of a revolution. Between those narrow walls on a worn-out carpet, he began rewriting his life one note at a time. At the age of 15, Paul met another boy who carried the same kind of wound, John Lennon. Their encounter in 1957 wasn't just two kids who happened to like guitars. It was the moment when two souls, each shaped by an early loss, recognized a rare, quiet understanding in the other. Both had lost their mothers. John's mother, Julia, died in a devastating car accident in 1958, just 2 years after Paul lost Mary. That shared wound, raw, wordless, forged a bond between them that felt like brotherhood built from pain, but lifted by melody. Music became the only language strong enough to mask the haunting silence of the night. They began as two boys trying to fill the void left by death, sitting on the floor of the simple room at Forthland Road, plucking strings in hopes of turning grief into song. That living room, with its old carpet and fraying sofa fabric, became their first recording studio. There were no studio lights, only two boys and the songs that would one day shake the world. From the foundation of the Quarrymen, the skiffle group John formed in 1956, those raw, early sounds slowly began to take shape into a real band. In 1957, Paul joined. Not long after, Paul was the one who brought in George Harrison. George was only 14, still young in technique, but with a musical instinct so sharp it stunned both John and Paul. Their cramped practice sessions in Liverpool weren't just rehearsals. They were three boys fumbling toward a doorway that even they couldn't yet see clearly. They had no guarantees in life, only slammed doors, rejection letters piling up, and nights spent playing music in beer-soaked bars from Liverpool to Hamburg. Amid the chaos, they often glanced at each other silently, wondering if anyone besides the four of them could hear the sound growing louder inside their own chests. Every local club gig, every night in Hamburg, with schedules that pushed them to exhaustion. All of it sharpened them from guitar-obsessed boys into a band with a real identity. By 1960, the name The Quarrymen felt too small. They changed names, experimented with versions before finally choosing the Beatles, a name no one at the time could have imagined would soon reshape global culture. Then in 1962 came the first devastating blow, the death of Stuart Sutcliffe. Stuart was not only an early bassist but the artistic soul of the group, the one who gave the Beatles a visual identity, a spirit, a vision the world would continue to recognize for decades. When Stuart died in 1962, it wasn't just a funeral, it was a moment of transition. Paul, who had never truly wanted that role, was pushed into playing bass. To him at the time, bass felt like the back seat of a bus, quiet, unnoticed, and in some ways beneath his dignity. I really didn't want to play bass. It felt like being pushed to the back, he later admitted, with a hint of resentment that had already settled. Yet it was that reluctant sacrifice that became a turning point. What began as an attempt to simply fill the space Stuart left behind slowly turned into Paul experimenting with the bass the way someone searches for their own voice, adding a soft passing note, shifting a downbeat, pulling a melody until it felt alive like a breathing string. No one realized exactly when it happened, but the very instrument he once avoided became the mark that would define an entire era. And the journey from a Liverpool boy to the man who helped shape modern culture was never a straight line. It was carved out of loss, sleepless nights, and a fierce belief that music could turn pain into something with a life of its own. When Beatlemania exploded, Paul didn't just brush against fame, he was pulled straight into the eye of the storm. Airports were forced to shut down, streets jammed with crowds, ambulances stationed outside every show. The screams drowned out the music so much so that even the Beatles themselves often couldn't hear what they were playing. The world orbited around those four young men like a cultural phenomenon with no precedent. They reshaped hairstyles, fashion, love, and the way an entire generation lived. The Beatles were not simply famous, they were the engine that turned the direction of popular culture. At the center of that storm, Paul became the band's creative engine. Yesterday, Let It Be Hey Jude, Penny, Lane Blackbird. These songs were no longer mere tracks. They became collective memories of millions. Abbey Road Studios and his home on Cavendish Avenue turned into the laboratories where he kept stretching the boundaries of sound-creating recordings that would outlive even him. But that light came with a rhythm no human body was built to endure. Endless nights in Hamburg, the pressure to keep creating, the constant travel pushed Paul towards stimulants just to stay awake. The encounter with Bob Dylan in 1964 only spun the wheel faster. Schedules, music, and sleep tangled into a chaos he sometimes longed to step out of, even if only for a few short hours. And like all uncontrolled spirals, the cost eventually arrived. He was arrested in Sweden, then Scotland, then Barbados, and most famously in Japan in 1980. The 9 days he spent in jail shocked the world and shifted how people looked at him. Paul could only sigh. "I wasn't looking for trouble. I was just stuck in a pace I didn't know how to stop." But Paul's falls didn't end there, because even as he staggered within the whirlwind of his own mistakes, fate was preparing a blow far more devastating. The most painful hit arrived in 1967 when Brian Epstein, their manager, their older brother, the anchor that kept the Beatles steady, died suddenly. Without Epstein, the Beatles' ship drifted off course. Paul was pushed into a leadership role he never wanted. That reluctance soon turned into exhaustion as he tried desperately to hold the group together, even while his bond with John, once the harmony of two souls sharing the same early wound, began to crack. Their songs, once written side by side, pulled toward opposite poles, Penny Lane glowing with light, while John retreated into Strawberry Fields and its introspection. Even the most carefree hit carried a faint aftertaste of unspoken rivalry, a quiet battle not just of music, but of identity. And then came one of the darkest, strangest chapters of his life, the Paul is Dead conspiracy of 1966. The world spread rumors that he had died in a car crash and been replaced by a look-alike. Fans dissected every lyric, every album cover like amateur detectives, turning admiration into mass hysteria. Paul, alive and breathing, had to watch people mourn him. The feeling was surreal and chilling, like seeing his own funeral through fogged glass. The wounds from being doubted, examined, hunted, dragged on in his mind like a shadow refusing to leave. The brighter the light, the longer the darkness behind him stretched. No one questioned Paul's talent, but the price he paid for that brilliance was steep. He once said, "The music is the goal, the fame is not." But music, when placed in a world this loud, always drags a price behind it, and sometimes that price is paid with the peace of the person who creates it. But this was only the beginning. The real fracture of the Beatles was still waiting just ahead. After Epstein's death, the studio was no longer a sanctuary for creation. The air felt thick, as if someone had turned down the volume on their brotherhood. Paul tried to manage to piece everything back together, but the more he held on, the more everything slipped out of his hands. Then came a September afternoon in 1969. John sat down, looked at Paul and Ringo, and spoke a sentence so short it seemed harmless. "I'm leaving." The room fell silent. No one cried, no one screamed. Only Paul sat frozen, as though he had just heard something crack sharply inside himself. The world knew nothing of it yet, but the darkness had already settled onto his shoulders. And on April 10th, 1970, when Paul was the one who had to walk out and say the words the world never wanted to hear, he understood that he had just ended a miracle. Millions were shocked, but he simply stood there quietly, carrying an emotional earthquake no one else could see. Yet behind the stage lights lay a truth far more brutal for Paul. The breakup of the Beatles wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the loss of the only haven he had ever built for himself. The Beatles to him weren't just a band, they were the family that the motherless boy had created to hold on to. They were his anchor, his escape, the force that kept him standing through the darkest years. And when that miracle shattered, Paul felt as though he had lost himself entirely. After the Beatles broke up, Paul vanished from London. He drove up to his farm in Scotland, letting the wind lash against his face until it burned. Paul slept on the sofa for hours, woke at noon, then drank again. Empty bottles rolled across the porch, and he no longer knew where day ended or night began. There was a moment when Paul sat alone in the cold kitchen, his guitar lying right in front of him, but his fingers only touched the strings and then fell away. The very thing that had saved him his whole life suddenly felt unfamiliar, like an old friend who no longer knew how to talk to him. Friends and the world believed he was resting. Only the small room on that farm knew the truth. Paul McCartney was trying to breathe beneath a suffocating layer of darkness. Years later, he summed it up in one short sentence. That was when the light went out. And no one needed to ask more, because everyone understood that the light he meant wasn't the light of a band, but the light inside his own heart. And when he stepped out of that wreckage, he was no longer the man standing before oceans of fans. He was a soul trying to hear his own voice again in the overwhelming silence, a silence heavier than any roar of applause he had ever heard in his life. For the first time in more than a decade, Paul McCartney walked into the world of art alone. In 1970, when the dusty remnants of the Beatles' breakup were still hanging in the air, he released McCartney, his first solo album. What looked like a quiet project was in reality the cry for help of a man trying to rebuild a life from whatever fragments remained. Paul played every instrument himself, recording inside his own home, turning each musical phrase into a form of therapy, not a performance. Critics at the time were cold. They called the album rough, unpolished, even self-indulgent. But many years later, when time had matured, the ears that once judged too quickly, people realized McCartney wasn't weakness. It was the sound of a heart collapsing, yet still creating in the dark so it wouldn't drown. In 1971, he and Linda released Rom. Again, the early wave of criticism came strange, unfocused, lacking the magic of Beatles' years. But as time settled over, Ram transformed into a classic, fragile, honest, and heartbreakingly inventive. Because back then, Paul wasn't trying to recreate the Beatles' miracle. He was rewriting himself from zero, from a place where even breath felt tangled with doubt. From those difficult days, Paul formed Wings in 1971 alongside Linda and guitarist Denny Laine. For him, Wings wasn't just a new band, it was a place to breathe, a space where he was allowed to stumble, to try again, without the shadow of the Beatles weighing down every step. But the path was far from smooth. The early years were chaos, constant lineup changes, audiences not yet ready to open their hearts, and the name McCartney pressing hard on his back, reminding him that anything he created would be compared until nothing was left untouched. Still, Paul moved forward, driven by his love for music, by the memory of those he had lost, and by one fear alone, that if he stopped, loneliness would swallow him whole. And then, in 1977, a small miracle happened. Mull of Kintyre rose to #1 in the UK, becoming one of the best-selling singles in the nation's history, surpassing even some of the Beatles' legendary hits. It wasn't a loud victory, it was the quiet triumph of resilience, a moment of redemption for a man who had stood back up from ruins. Paul later said, "When you lose the people who understood you without words, the only place left to speak is inside a song." Those albums weren't just music. They were Paul trying to feel his way back to himself. Even in the applause that seemed to lift him, there was still a locked room inside him, a place where the unnamed losses lived. And that door only opened when Linda entered his life. In Paul's long journey of heartbreak, the chapter with Linda is the gentlest map of all. Without noise, without spectacle, Linda appeared like a steady breath beside him, the quiet partner, the mother of his children, and the only hand that never let go even when the whole world turned the other way. Paul met Linda during the wild height of Beatlemania when he was in his early 20s, surrounded by fame, screams, desire, and blinding lights. But what he found in Linda was not the worship of a fan. He found eyes that could see the real man behind the legend. Their love wasn't fed by stage lights, but by small things, simple dinners, long late-night conversations, clumsy jokes only they understood, and a depth of understanding that needed no words at all. In 1969, they married just as the world was about to witness the Beatles' collapse. While the globe mourned the end of a music empire, Paul found salvation in Linda's arms. They raised 4 children, Mary, Stella, James, and Heather, Linda's daughter from a previous marriage, whom Paul lovingly adopted as his own. That family became their small fortress, separate from the noise outside. But Linda wasn't just the keeper of their home. She learned instruments, played with Paul in Wings, and stood on stage before thousands, even when she was mocked, criticized, or dismissed, a kind of invisible violence only those who loved an artist could understand. Paul stood with her always. Linda's presence on stage wasn't about musical perfection. It was a declaration of love. Then, in 1995, came the harshest test of all. Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer at 53, the very illness that had taken Paul's mother when he was just 14. A brutal loop, a nightmare he thought he had buried long ago. "I cried for a year," Paul told the BBC. "It was the worst thing that ever happened to me." Linda passed away on April 17, 1998. At 55, Paul did not just lose his wife. He lost the only person who had ever healed the childhood wounds that fame could never reach. He lost the woman who had turned a global superstar into a better, kinder man. He once said there were days when simply walking into an empty room was enough to make his chest tighten. The keepsakes. Linda's laughter-old recordings, family videos became sacred relics he carried with him to remind himself that their love had truly existed. For years, Paul wandered alone along country roads, sinking into a silence no music could fill. "You never get over a loss like that," he said. "You just learn to live with the emptiness." And yet, even in that unbearable pain, Paul held on to the ideals they had built together. Vegetarianism, protecting animals, living sustainably, and always speaking of Linda in a particular tone, the voice of a man who knows he was lucky to love someone who didn't just pass through his life, but shaped it. In the darkest moment of his life, Paul McCartney took his grief and turned it into the legacy of love. And in doing so, he reminded the world that behind every legend there is a love story too fragile for headlines, too pure to be doubted, and too eternal to be forgotten. But just when Paul thought he had found a small patch of peace after losing Linda, life steered him toward another turn. It did not take anyone away this time, but it was strong enough to shake the fragile beliefs he had only just managed to piece back together. When Paul McCartney met Heather Mills in 1999, he was 57, a man still carrying the emptiness left behind by his marriage to Linda. Heather, a former model and charity campaigner, entered his life with a kind of energy that was hard to pin down, strong-willed, open, and full of expectations. Paul believed that at his age he still had the right to love again, rather than return to loneliness. They married in 2002 when he turned 60, and in that moment Paul found the courage to open his heart one more time. But the hope that had only just begun to flicker was quickly put to the test. Their love became a perfect target under the media's lens. Every step they took was scrutinized, every detail twisted into rumor. In 2003, the birth of their daughter Beatrice brought Paul a gentle ray of sunshine, a sense that life might truly be starting over. Yet the quiet cracks in the relationship kept widening. Suspicion, venomous whispers, and stories no one could verify turned their marriage into a mental battlefield instead of a refuge. Their divorce in 2008, when he was 66, was not just a legal procedure. It was a war of tears and pride. The court case dragged on, laid bare across front pages filled with harsh accusations from both sides. Heather spoke openly about her pain. Paul chose silence. And sometimes silence is the loudest voice, the confession of a man too exhausted to fight back. The final ruling went against Heather's demands, and the much smaller settlement closed a stormy chapter. Even so, the most astonishing thing about Paul is that after everything he still did not give up on love. Even with his heart broken twice, he never locked it away. That alone reveals the gentlest and most steadfast part of him, a man who has weathered countless storms and still wants to believe in beautiful things. Nancy Shevell entered Paul's life so quietly that he almost couldn't pinpoint when it began. No fireworks, no crashing waves, just a calm evening when he realized he was talking to someone whose presence brought his heartbeat back to its natural rhythm. By then, Paul no longer looked like the untouchable legend, nor like the hardened man who had just walked out of a courtroom full of turmoil. He was simply a man who had spent too many years unable to sleep, leaning back in his chair and breathing slowly. Nancy sat beside him, not asking too many questions, not trying to fill the silence, just being there, patient like the last light of day resting on a doorstep. From quiet walks to simple shared meals, Paul slowly came to understand a new love does not always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it appears as a gentle calm light enough not to break anything that is already fragile. Their relationship was built more on respect than explosive passion, more on honesty than easy promises. In 2011, Paul and Nancy were married in a small ceremony soft as a sigh. No spectacle, no chaos, just two people finding each other. Precisely when life had made them ready to need one another. Nancy did not want to stand under the spotlight and bask in Paul's reflected glory. She only wanted to walk beside him. That was something Paul had never truly had in all the chaotic years before. Those close to him say they saw a change in Paul, gentler, slower, as if he had finally allowed his heart to rest. In rare interviews, he speaks of Nancy with calm affection, calling her the balance he had spent his whole life searching for. No scandal, no drama, no weary sighs, only stillness. Exactly what a man who has lived his entire life under the roar of crowds needs most. In these latter years, Paul McCartney, the man who once wrote love songs that intoxicated the whole world, finally has a love that does not need a stage to prove itself. A love peaceful enough to soothe a heart that has endured more scars than most. By 2015, he began cutting out all stimulants completely for the sake of his growing grandchildren, for the way they looked at him not as a legend, but as a grandfather who needed to be reliable. "Kids watch how you live," he said, "not what you say." Even so, those earlier years never vanish from his memory. They linger like a thin mist on a morning mirror. But Paul speaks of them with a calm voice, neither trying to romanticize them nor to run away. They are simply part of what it means to live under a light that is both dazzling and merciless. A place where every step can lead him into trouble, or into a kind of growth no textbook can teach. In the end, he leaves us with a gentle reminder worth holding on to. Salvation does not always lie in grand decisions, but in the small choices we repeat every day, the ones strong enough to lead a person out from under the shadow of his own past. Today at 83, Paul McCartney lives a life of quiet that seems almost unbelievable for someone who once stood at the epicenter of the music world, yet behind that calm are old wounds that still smolder. There are no more frantic flights across continents, no more endless screams behind red velvet curtains, only soft mornings spread across 3 slices of memory London Sussex and the Hamptons. 3 homes, 3 different cross-sections of a life woven between dazzling lights and the stillness he spent nearly an entire lifetime trying to reach. Walking beside him is Nancy Shevell, a woman who did not enter his life to change the world, but simply to make it feel a little less heavy. Their days are filled with small joys Paul never had the chance to savor in his youth: strolls in the garden, simple dinners that don't require elaborate menus, bursts of laughter in a warm kitchen. It is the kind of peace the young Beatle of the 1960s could never have imagined, surrounded by paparazzi, the hurricane of Beatlemania, and sleepless nights spent chasing songs. Now he holds his life a little more lightly, even if the old scars still rest beneath the skin. Because in that quiet, Paul still carries the shadows of a lifetime, his mother Mary, who left too early for him to say goodbye; Linda, the soulmate whose loss once shattered him; John Lennon, the irreplaceable other half of his musical soul; and George Harrison, who left him a fir tree he talks to whenever the emptiness comes back. And there is another darkness. Paul rarely mentions the sound of the Beatles breaking apart, the moment when four young men who once echoed around the globe had to walk separate paths. The people who are gone and the moments that have slipped away have never truly left him. They simply stand in a quieter corner, watching him go on living. In a 2023 interview, Paul confessed a very human fear. "I'm afraid that one day I won't remember what their voices sound like." A simple sentence, yet enough to strip away the illusion of immortality from a legend the world assumes will never fade. In those eyes colored now by time, there is not only eternal creativity, but also the dread that memory itself might one day betray its owner. And yet even as he lives with the echoes of those who are gone, Paul McCartney has kept a remarkable level of health and vitality. He is strictly vegetarian, practices yoga walks every day, and has eliminated the bad habits that once clung to him in the Beatles years. Because of that, Paul, at an age when many have long withdrawn from the spotlight, still steps on stage with a strange kind of energy, calm but never stale, gentle but never weak. In 2024, he carried on with his Got Back tour. In each city, tens of thousands of people sang along to songs he had written long before many of them were born. Those voices, spanning 3 or 4 generations, merge into living proof that the music he created does not merely survive. It continues to grow like a living being. Each night, as tens of thousands of voices rise together on the last line of "Hey Jude," Paul is no longer just the songwriter on stage. He becomes a bridge between memory and the present, between youth and hard-earned wisdom, between an era that has vanished and the generations standing on the sidelines looking back. And then on August 4th, 2025, another milestone of stubborn life, his new studio album was completed. Not a flashy attempt at a comeback, but a simple acknowledgement that his heart still has something it wants to say, to record, to send out into the world. At 83, that feels like a miracle. But for Paul McCartney, perhaps it is simply the way he continues to live. Financially, Paul stands among the wealthiest artists on the planet, with a fortune exceeding $1 billion. Yet unlike the extravagant image often attached to millionaires, Paul has never treated wealth as something to flaunt. To him, it is a responsibility, a way of saying thank you to a world that has given him so much. It is widely believed that in his yet unrevealed will, a large portion of his fortune will go to his children and to charitable causes. That choice perfectly mirrors the philosophy he has lived by: when you are given something, you owe it to life to give part of it back. For decades, Paul has quietly supported organizations that protect animals, help children in need, and fund medical research. He has financed numerous music education programs in the UK, giving underprivileged children the chance to access instruments. After Linda's death, he continued the environmental campaigns she had championed, contributing to climate change initiatives and promoting greener ways of living. Paul rarely talks about these donations. He simply does them as a kind habit forged by a lifetime of loss, which taught him that kindness is also a form of legacy. And so Paul McCartney stands as a beautiful paradox, a legend who lives quietly like an ordinary man, a global icon who fears losing the voices only he can hear, an artist who changed the world, yet still bows his head before the memory of his mother, his wife, his friends, and the years that have passed. His life is not only told through fame, it is woven from deep wounds, great loves, and countless acts of standing back up, a kind of strength no single song could ever fully express. Perhaps that is Paul McCartney's greatest legacy, not just the music, but a life that proves a heart, one that has known pain, Love and loss can create melodies that never fade. From a Liverpool boy growing up amid post-war ruins to a man standing before millions in vast stadiums, Paul McCartney's path has never been a straight line. It is a life interlaced with miracles and heartbreak. Along the way, he has had to face scandal, betrayal, the loneliness of being a legend, and chapters so painful they made him doubt he could ever rise again. What makes his journey extraordinary is this tragedy did not end him. It simply made him sing deeper, live more slowly, and love with more endurance. At 83, Paul McCartney still writes, music still walks onto the stage, and still offers the world a light that life itself has not always been kind enough to give him. If this story touched you, please leave a heart and hit subscribe so you can stay with us on more beyond heartbreaking journeys of the legends. Thank you for watching until the very end of the video.